But I'd like to start with 3 slides on where I'm coming from that are professional, personal, and popular culture. So the first one is, I'm sorry, professionally. I've worked with organizations that believe in blue skies and green grassroots, that are basically optimistic organizations, Save the Children, the Bernard van Leer Foundation, and the Firelight Foundation, basically that believe strongly in change that happens at the grassroots and its importance in children's well-being, and also that the grassroots, the community level, is an innovative level, is a level from which change comes and one to be factored seriously into one's efforts. Now, on a personal level, my personal take on resilience comes really from my home life. My wife Marie is from Rwanda. The first time I went to Rwanda, we met during the genocide in Central African Republic. And the first time I went to Rwanda was to get married in 1995, a year after the genocide. All around our house, there were signs of funeral notices, and this person is being disinterred in order to be given a good burial. And there were all sorts of signs of mourning and of difficulty. And yet, I was very well received, warmly received, and only had a good impression of Rwandan culture from my first encounter. And I thought to myself, well, how do these two things go together? How does living through a stress like that and still having your values intact and still being able to show the best of your society, how does that work? Actually, also during our courtship, Marie would often say, I was in West Africa, she was in East Africa, we would meet up in Dakar, in Paris, in Nairobi. Oh, I know some Rwandans here, let's go out to dinner. The entire dinner would be a processing of what the country had been through in terms of personal loss, in terms of what happened to institutions, what happened to leaders, etc. It was difficult to think in 1995 that this country would be one that had actually pulled ahead of the pack in terms of its capacities, in terms of its ability to deliver. And I have to say it's my personal standard for what I think of in terms of resilience, and one that has caused me to be somewhat critical of efforts I've been involved in the past. And then since I'm in New York, I thought I would put just a popular culture example up here as well. You can hum along when you recognize it. And my son, if he had been here, would have put the music on the PowerPoint, but that's beyond my own capacities. So having this discussion in a taxi heading downtown, rearranging my position, this friend of mine who had a bit of a breakdown. I said, well, breakdowns come and breakdowns go. So what are you going to do about it? That's what I'd like to know. Paul Simon. The idea of breakdowns, but also, I think very importantly, the idea of rearranging my position, because in our experience, that's a lot of what happens in terms of resilience. It's thinking through, where was I, where am I now, how do I get back to where I want to be? So now into working definitions. We were asked for a definition of resilience. I start with just the basic, not even physical science, but metallurgical definition. Taking one's own shape back after shock or stress. And I put self there because I'm more on the social science side and working by analogy. In Bernard van Leer, we were basically working on child development and had psychology as a basic discipline. The absence of expected pathology after trauma related to a sort of positive deviance approach. And then I think in social change philanthropy, really reclaiming and repairing one's basic characteristics and assets. And one thing I want to come to is to stress an idea of what is the key asset that one is seeking to promote or repair. Then just to say a little bit about Save the Children, as Jeannot said, I was with them for 8 years in West Africa with Mali, and the key asset that we were working with was community solidarity. This won't surprise anyone who has worked in Africa. The most abundant and renewable resource on the continent, and yet one that is very poorly integrated with system delivery from the government. We were particularly in the area of education, where there is a lot of community-side interest in school success, and there's a lot of governmental effort to expand the schooling system, but they haven't been well integrated in the national planning or in the ways that CBOs and NGOs interact with the government. And in this case, I think resilience, as I was looking at it there, was not recovering from a shock, but really uncovering an untapped asset, the power of solidarity. I wanted to give just an example. Jenna mentioned the village schools experience. Save the Children helped about 800 communities establish primary schools in Mali, a country of 10,000 villages which had 2,000 schools in the beginning of the 90s. And the schools were established with about 18 times faster than the historical government establishment rate of schools, just by bringing together the latent energy at the community level with the structures and the ideas set up at the government level. Also involved gender parity, and 10 years after funding has ended, are still going, most of the 800. Sorry. At the Bernard van Leer Foundation, we focused on early childhood as a programmatic area. And really the asset, I would say, that we were trying to support is the idea of circles of support around children. First at the household level, second at the community level, then government services and policy. And very much a foundation that took as its watchword building on the strengths of people, building on what already exists. This brings up a theme I will come back to at the end in terms of a continuum between responsive philanthropy and proactive philanthropy. The responsive, basically funding what comes to you, the best ideas that come to you. Proactive, really pursuing a goal and saying, we will establish partnerships with those who want to help us reach that goal. I think on that continuum, both the Bernard van Leer Foundation and the Firelight Foundation are on the responsive side, and I would say that normally the responsive philanthropy is a better mesh with resilience than very strongly proactive philanthropy. So one question I would ask of the Rockefeller folks in the room is, where do you think you land on a continuum between responsive and proactive? This book about promoting resilience in children, one resource that we published, I'm not sure the level of relevance for Rockefeller, because it was on a very personal individual child development sort of framework, but basically a simple framework that practitioners can understand in any setting. Now, where I'm critical of resilience programming, I think Frances would agree with me entirely from her presentation, is whether it makes a good programmatic framework, make a good programmatic approach. Bernard van Leer tried to move from this idea of the absence of individual pathology, the clinical psychology definition of resilience, to one of group protective behaviors. And the road was bumpy for us. I think partly because we didn't think through well enough how we thought that worked. Among the challenges, that the situations we were working with were not situations of acute trauma, but usually of chronic stress. And right there we diverged with the psychological model. And I mea culpa, we did have a vaguely defined construct of resilience. And I think most importantly, it was hypothetical. It's somewhere in the future. It will happen if we do this, probably. But we didn't really say what we thought it was, and we didn't construct our projects with long enough time frames to actually be there when the outcome should have happened. I would say that some of our interventions were actually, they were nice to have, they were fun, they were good for kids. This is a risk of being in the young children business. But I don't think they were adequate to bringing about the sorts of resilience that I saw, for example, in Rwanda. I think they would not have sustained that. Again, time frame's too short. And if your construct is vague, your M&E is going to suffer for that as well. So I offer all of these things to Rockefeller as caveats. And I would agree with what Francis had said earlier, that it may be a better analytical framework than a programmatic approach. But I would be very interested in talking to people about how they think about that. So about Firelight. We are a California-based funder that supports African organizations. As Jano said, about 2.5 million full orphans, as they say, or double orphans who've lost both parents. 10 million have lost one parent. Of the 2.5 million, let me just go ahead. A very resilient response. Of these 2.5 million who've lost both parents, 95% of them are still in an extended family situation. 5% are on the streets or in institutions. I ask you to think about what would happen in the States if there were 2.5 million children orphaned in every town, every state, every city. But I think that really the response of African families and communities to the situation of these children is a very interesting and instructive example of social resilience. 90% of the support that these children receive is face-to-face. It's from extended family. It's from near neighbors. It's not from national government. It's certainly not from international assistance, whether that be government to government or philanthropy. So the real name of the game is what happens close to kids. And there are community-based organizations everywhere in the countries that we work in. Those of you who have worked in Africa, and I excuse or I apologize for being Africa-focused on this, but that's just the terrain my foundation works on. You know that there's a strong both solidarity and working together at the local community sort of reflex. That reflex has been very much called on in the situation of children affected by AIDS. The estimation is that there is one child-focused grassroots organization for every 1,200 people in Uganda, that there are 50,000 community-based organizations in South Africa, that the collective labor of faith-based organizations helping children alone is $5 billion a year. So this is it's a very large phenomenon. In some ways, you could say it's already at scale, and there are already channels for lateral replication. So it turns on its head some of the ideas about let's innovate and then figure out how to get it around. Really, the structure is around. The question is how to help it grow. We support about 150 community-based organizations and try to select them in a way that they are representative of several 100,000 organizations. Now the question, or one very important question, is how far can this resilience go? How far can this flexible response go? And what happens if resilience moves to brittleness and moves to breakage? What happens for kids? In order to take a look at this, and this is how Suman and I met at a learning conference at the Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. We have constructed a sort of learning agenda that we use across our grants. As a responsive funder, we fund a lot of different things, and we can't have one single set of indicators. I imagine you're in the same boat. So we tried to come up with meta questions that would go across all the grants that we make and that would instruct us about our basic understanding of community-based organizations. So those 5 questions are basically, what do community-based organizations do to promote child well-being, and why do they do it? And I would say that why is very important and often not asked. And I'd say it's more important to sustainability than financial questions. How do they choose to work? Do they work face-to-face with visiting households? Do they try to get the government to do its job? Do they try to offer services themselves? What benefits and beneficiaries do they choose and why? And how do they themselves assess impact? We put that question in basically because we really wanted to have a dialogue going on with grantees about what is impact in their eyes, because there is plenty of discussion at the funder level about what impact is. knowing the answers to those three questions, or having an evolving understanding of that, what do we think is the optimal handshake between government service and community action, and how does that evolve from context to context, depending on the economy, the political situation, the sophistication of civil society. And then knowing those four things, what's the best way for us to support community-based organizations, not only in funding them, but also in getting word around to others about the strengths and the challenges of community-based organizations. So this is the last one, just lessons about resilience. Easy to love the idea, but hard to program around. And I think anyone who's interested in social change will be responsive to the idea of resilience. But how to actually have it guide your work is a question worthy of the collective reflection of all the people in the room. What's the asset that you're seeking to repair, to strengthen, to multiply? Now, I realized in listening to Frances that this is a pretty static view of resilience. I was going through her roller coaster of an infinite loop, and I need to think about that and how it relates to our work. But I think if you just come away from situations saying, what is the asset that we're hoping we can help people preserve and use, it's a very important thing. Work harder to clarify and articulate, especially along with those who are doing the daily work. I think that resilience is an attractive concept, but frankly, it's an easy thing to do without enough clarity. Everyone responds so positively to it that it's easy to say, yes, let's make it a column, let's make it a pillar of what we do, but I think it takes serious effort to really articulate what one means by it. And this is a similar reflection. Since it is mostly a hypothetical construct, it's easy to just articulate it and not really hold oneself accountable for attaining. I would even say that for me, it's more useful to look retrospectively about resilience than to look prospectively, because it's if you look retrospectively and say, here's a situation where people kept their assets when they might not have, or here's a situation of success where I might not have expected that. You can study it closely, you can look at it, you can draw conclusions from it. If you are speculating about the future for an abstract concept in a very complex situation, it's hard to do that accurately. It's hard to do that in a way that you can come back to and really assess. So I would just encourage people to look back as well as forward and give yourself a long enough time frame to be able to look back at your own efforts as well. And then just this last question on responsive versus proactive philanthropy. To caricature, say, the Gates Foundation, primarily interested in creating new breakthroughs. The AIDS vaccine, microbicides, very interested in hard science, very interested in finding the folks who can help them take apart those questions. In a proactive strategy like that, often there's not a lot of attention given to resilience. Usually only if resilience is the one link in the chain. If it's weak, you don't get to your objective. So and frankly, let me put my cards on the table. What I know of the Rockefeller Foundation, which is dated and it comes mostly from 50 years ago, was that it was a very proactive foundation. I assume that's somewhat in the DNA of the Rockefeller Foundation, that breakthroughs are important, that discoveries, betting on heroic entrepreneurs, etc. I may be caricaturing, I may be way off, but let me put it on the table. May be part of your organizational DNA. If it is, you really need to think a bit harder about where does resilience fit in that than if you were basically saying, we're a solidarity grant maker, and we do that partly because we think that the wisdom, the power, the creativity is already in those that we grant to.